25 forgotten sites are about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about ancient history. By the end of this journey, you will see that our past was far more complex and interconnected than any textbook ever suggested. The popular story of early civilization leans on a handful of famous names like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Stonehenge. Yet scattered across the globe are dozens of lesser-known archaeological treasures that hold evidence capable of reshaping our timeline, our origins, and the capabilities of our ancestors. Many of these findings are recent, some are still fiercely debated. What if the first temple was not Göbekli Tepe, but something older? What if humans reached the Americas tens of thousands of years earlier than we believe? What else might still be buried, waiting to overturn our understanding of who we are? For decades, Göbekli Tepe held the title of the world's first known temple, a site that pushed the dawn of complex ritual back to 11,600 years ago. But a discovery in southeastern Turkey now suggests that even that ancient milestone was not the beginning. Boncuklu Tarla, a settlement dating to around 12,000 years ago, contains monumental structures and carved stone pillars that predate Göbekli Tepe by at least several centuries. The site challenges the long-held assumption that organized religion and public architecture emerged in a single flash. Instead, it points to a gradual and much older tradition of communal gathering and symbolic expression. Archaeologists working here have uncovered T-shaped pillars similar in style to those found at Göbekli Tepe, but older. These limestone monoliths stand in circular enclosures, their surfaces etched with animal motifs like snakes, scorpions, and birds. The carvings are not merely decorative. They appear to carry meaning, possibly representing spirits, clan symbols, or stories about the natural world. The presence of such artistry so many millennia ago forces researchers to reconsider how quickly human societies developed complex belief systems. What makes Boncuklu Tarla even more remarkable is the evidence of social organization. The site includes public buildings, communal gathering spaces, and a layout that suggests careful planning. People did not just live here in small family groups. They came together for shared projects, feasts, and ceremonies that required cooperation across a large community. This level of coordination, long before the invention of writing or the wheel, speaks to a sophisticated social fabric that had been weaving itself for generations. The name Boncuklu Tarla means beaded field in Turkish, a reference to the thousands of stone beads and ornaments found scattered across the area. These objects hint at trade, personal adornment, and perhaps even social status. They show that people were thinking in terms of beauty, identity, and exchange thousands of years before the first cities rose. For years, the story of the Neolithic revolution focused on the Fertile Crescent and a handful of key sites. Boncuklu Tarla now joins that narrative as an older, quieter chapter. It tells us that the urge to gather, to carve meaning into stone, and to build something larger than a single home is not a sudden invention but a deep human impulse. The question is no longer whether Göbekli Tepe was truly first. The question is how many more such sites lie underground, waiting to push the dawn of civilization back even further. Across the border in modern-day Syria, another discovery from the same ancient era is quietly challenging the way we picture the first farming villages. Tell Qarassa sits in the fertile basin of the Ledger region, a landscape of black basalt rock that once supported a community living around 12,000 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age. Excavations here have revealed something remarkable, a settlement that was not a haphazard cluster of huts but a carefully laid out village with stone-built houses, shared courtyards, and clear zones for different activities. The inhabitants built with purpose. Walls were aligned along consistent axes, doorways faced communal spaces, and structures were rebuilt on the same foundations generation after generation. This kind of planning implies a society that thought ahead, that coordinated labor, and that valued stability and shared space. For a long time, the standard story held that the first fully settled farming communities did not appear until later in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, around 9,000 years ago. Tell Qarassa pushes that timeline back by at least 1,000 years and shifts the geographic focus westward into the Levant. But the site offers more than just early architecture. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of long-distance trade networks that connected this small village to resources hundreds of miles away. Obsidian from central Anatolia, shells from the Mediterranean coast, and greenstone from distant quarries all made their way here. These were not accidental finds. The obsidian, for example, arrived as carefully prepared blades and cores, suggesting established exchange routes and skilled craftsmen who knew exactly what they needed. Such trade implies communication, trust, and shared cultural practices across regions. The early farmers of Tell Qarassa were not isolated. They were part of a web of contact that spanned the ancient Near East. The village also provides some of the earliest signs of domesticated crops in the region. Grains like emmer wheat and barley were being cultivated, though wild resources still supplemented the diet. This was a transitional period when people were learning to manage plants, experimenting with planting and harvesting, slowly moving from foraging to farming. The pace was gradual, not a sudden revolution. What makes Tell Qarassa especially valuable is the preservation of its burial customs. The dead were interred beneath the floors of houses, often in a flexed position, sometimes with grave goods like beads or tools. This practice, known as intramural burial, suggests a deep connection between the living and the ancestors. It speaks to a belief system where the departed remained part of the household, watching over the family, maybe even protecting the harvest. In one notable case, a young woman was buried with a necklace of over 1,000 stone beads, each one painstakingly drilled and polished. The effort invested in such an item speaks to the importance of the individual and the resources the community was willing to dedicate to remembrance. These burials are not grim. They are windows into how these early people understood life, death, and identity. Tell Qarassa stands as a quiet counterpoint to the idea that complex society was born in the great river valleys. Here, in a rocky corner of southern Syria, a community was already building planned settlements, trading across vast distances, and gradually domesticating the plants that would feed future civilizations. The site reminds us that social sophistication did not wait for kings or cities. It emerged in small villages among neighbors who worked together, remembered their ancestors, and reached out to the wider world. What happened to these early Levantine communities, and why did some of them vanish while others thrived? The answers may lie in another neglected site, one that hides a mystery of abandonment and survival. The ground beneath our feet hides more than bones and pottery. It hides the very birth of technology. At a site in central Turkey called Can Hasan III, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that the age of metal began much earlier than the textbooks say. For generations, the standard timeline taught that copper smelting started around 5000 BCE, during what scholars call the Chalcolithic period. But the finds at Can Hasan III push that date back by 2,000 years to roughly 7000 BCE. That is not a small adjustment. It is a fundamental shift in how we understand human innovation. What makes the site so important is not just the presence of copper. It is the full picture of a community that had learned to extract metal from ore. Excavators found fragments of copper slag, the waste material left over after smelting. They also uncovered what appear to be small furnaces, structures built to reach the high temperatures needed to separate copper from its rocky surroundings. These are not accidental discoveries. They are the fingerprints of a deliberate and controlled process. Imagine a village where people already knew how to plant crops, build houses, and trade goods. Then one day, someone noticed that certain green stones turned into a shiny red metal when placed in a very hot fire. That observation must have been astonishing. But the people of Can Hasan III did not stop at a single curiosity. They experimented, they built furnaces, they learned to manage fire in new ways. They began to shape the very substance of the earth. The copper they produced was not yet used for weapons or large tools. Most of the artifacts found are small items like beads, pins, and tiny ornaments. But the significance is not in the size. The significance is in the step itself. Once a society learns to smelt metal, the door opens to everything else: stronger tools, lasting containers, better weapons, and eventually alloys like bronze. The entire trajectory of civilization changes. What is especially fascinating is how early this happened in Anatolia, the region of modern Turkey. Can Hasan III sits in a landscape that was already home to some of the world's first farming villages. These were not primitive camps. They were organized communities with a deep knowledge of their environment. The leap from working with stone to working with metal may have seemed small at first, but it was a transformation as profound as the invention of agriculture. For decades, historians assumed that metallurgy spread from a single birthplace, perhaps in the mountains of Iran or Mesopotamia. Can Hasan III suggests instead that multiple communities were experimenting with copper at roughly the same time, or even earlier. This changes the story from a single inventor to a widespread awakening. The urge to transform stone into metal may have been a natural human impulse, one that emerged in different places independently. The site also raises questions about how knowledge was shared. Did a traveler carry the secret of smelting from one village to another, or did each community discover it on their own? The evidence from Can Hasan III hints at a network of ideas, but the exact path remains unclear. What is clear is that by 7000 BCE, some people in central Anatolia had already crossed a threshold that would eventually lead to the Bronze Age. Yet Can Hasan III remains relatively unknown outside specialist circles. Most discussions of early metallurgy begin with later sites in the Balkans or the Middle East. This forgotten village in Turkey deserves a much larger place in our story. It tells us that human creativity is not a straight line. It is a series of experiments, some successful, some abandoned, all of them pushing the boundaries of what was possible. As we consider this early mastery of fire and stone, we have to wonder what other buried experiments are still waiting to be found. If copper smelting happened this early, what else might have been invented and then forgotten, only to be reinvented centuries later? The next site we examine offers a glimpse into a different kind of transformation, one that changed how people organized their entire society. In the rugged landscape of southern Jordan, a different kind of transformation unfolded around 7,000 years ago. Wadi Faynan is not a single village or temple. It is an entire mining district stretching across dozens of square miles, a place where ancient people dug into the earth on a scale that rivals some modern operations. This was not a small experiment with a few stones and a campfire. This was the first known industrial landscape in human history. The evidence is staggering. Archaeologists have mapped more than 10,000 mine shafts cut into the hillsides. They have found piles of copper slag weighing tens of thousands of tons, the waste left over from smelting. Some of these slag heaps are over 20 feet deep. The sheer volume of material processed here suggests that generations of people, working over many centuries, extracted and refined copper in quantities that would not be matched for thousands of years. The timeline is equally impressive. Activity at Wadi Faynan began around the 5th millennium BCE, long before the Great Bronze Age civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley rose to power. At a time when most people still lived in small farming villages, the inhabitants of this region were already organizing large-scale labor, managing complex supply chains and exporting their metal across the ancient Near East. The copper from Wadi Faynan traveled far. Chemical analysis of artifacts found in Egypt and the Levant matches the unique signature of ore from this site. Pieces of copper tools, jewelry, and even small weapons from as far away as the Nile Delta have been traced back to these Jordanian mines. This means that a sophisticated trade network existed more than 6,000 years ago, connecting the desert of southern Jordan with the emerging cities along the Nile and the coastal settlements of the Mediterranean. The scale of this operation required more than just mining skill. It required organization, planning, and a system of distribution that spanned hundreds of miles. The environmental footprint of Wadi Faynan is still visible today. The hills are scarred with trenches and pits. The ancient smelters burned enormous quantities of wood, stripping the surrounding landscape of trees. Researchers have analyzed pollen samples from nearby lake beds and found evidence of widespread deforestation during the peak of the mining period. The air would have been filled with smoke and the clang of hammers. This was not a quiet village industry. It was a noisy, dirty, and powerful engine of production that shaped the land itself. For decades, historians assumed that large-scale metallurgy only appeared after the rise of the first cities in Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago. Sites like and Uruk were thought to be the birthplace of industrial metalworking, but Wadi Faynan pushes that timeline back by more than 1,000 years and shifts the geographic focus to the southern Levant. It shows that the drive to extract and transform metal was not dependent on urban centers. It emerged in a region of small farming communities who nevertheless managed to create something enormous. The people who worked these mines were not slaves in the way we might imagine. Evidence suggests a mix of local inhabitants and specialized craftsmen who moved between sites. The organization of labor appears to have been collaborative rather than coercive, though the work was certainly hard and dangerous. The tunnels were narrow and dark. The heat from the smelters was intense, but the rewards were great. Copper was a valuable commodity, sought after for tools, ornaments, and weapons. It may have served as a form of currency, a way to measure wealth and status. Wadi Faynan also challenges the idea that technological progress is a straight line. For reasons still debated, the site was abandoned around 3,000 years ago. The mines fell silent, the smelters went cold. The knowledge of large-scale extraction may have faded from this region for centuries. When later civilizations like the Romans and Byzantines discovered copper deposits in the same area, they had to reinvent many of the techniques that had been used here thousands of years earlier. This pattern of discovery, loss, and rediscovery appears again and again in human history. What makes Wadi Faynan so important is that it preserves the evidence of an early success, a moment when a community harnessed the power of the earth and built something that reached far beyond their own horizon. As we stand in the shadow of those ancient slag heaps, we are reminded that industry, trade, and environmental change are not modern inventions. They are threads woven deep into the fabric of our past. And if this site could be forgotten for so long, what other industrial landscapes might still be hidden beneath the sands of time? The next location we explore offers a glimpse into a completely different kind of sophistication, one carved not from metal but from stone and water. On the arid coast of Peru, a complex of stone and earth predates the pyramids of Giza by centuries. El Paraíso, located in the Chillon Valley near modern Lima, is one of the oldest monumental ceremonial centers in the Americas. Construction began around 3,500 BCE, a time when the first dynasties of Egypt were still centuries away, and the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia had not yet risen. Yet here, on a windswept terrace overlooking the Pacific, ancient builders erected massive platform mounds and sunken circular plazas that required moving hundreds of thousands of tons of rock and fill. The scale is staggering. The main mound rises nearly 60 feet high and spans several acres at its base. To build it, workers quarried stone from nearby hills, shaped it into blocks, and carried it to the site using only human labor. There were no draft animals, no wheeled vehicles, no metal tools. Everything was accomplished through coordinated effort and generations of accumulated knowledge. The site includes several smaller mounds arranged around open courtyards, creating a formal, planned layout that speaks to deliberate design. Excavations have revealed multiple building phases, showing that El Paraíso was not a single project but a living center expanded and remodeled over many centuries. This kind of sustained investment implies a society with strong leadership, shared religious or civic purpose, and the ability to organize large groups of people for extended periods. For decades, the dominant narrative held that complex society in the Americas emerged later, around 1600 BC with the Olmec in Mesoamerica. El Paraíso shatters that timeline by nearly 2,000 years. It demonstrates that along the coast of Peru, people were building monumental architecture and organizing themselves into hierarchical communities at the same time as the early civilizations of the Old World. The project required not just muscle but planning, surveying, water management, and the coordination of labor across multiple villages were all necessary. The builders also constructed a network of canals to irrigate fields of cotton, beans, and squash, crops that supported a growing population. Cotton was particularly important because it was used to make fishing nets, a vital tool for a coastal people who relied heavily on marine resources. The diet of the inhabitants was rich in fish, shellfish, and seabirds, supplemented by cultivated plants. This mix of fishing and farming created a stable food supply that freed people to work on large construction projects. The ceremonial nature of El Paraíso is evident in its layout. The sunken circular plazas, some more than 60 feet in diameter, were likely used for public gatherings, rituals, and performances. They were lined with stone and plaster, and their acoustics suggest they were designed for sound to carry, perhaps for speeches or chants. Small chambers and niches in the mounds may have held offerings or housed important individuals. In one area, excavators found the remains of a ritual hearth filled with burned offerings, including shells and plant material. These details paint a picture of a vibrant ceremonial life, a community that gathered regularly to reaffirm shared beliefs and social bonds. What makes El Paraíso especially significant is that it was largely abandoned around 2500 BCE, long before the rise of later Peruvian cultures like Chavin or Mach. The site was not destroyed by war or catastrophe. Instead, it seems to have been deliberately closed, with the main entrances sealed and the plazas filled in. Why this happened remains a mystery. Perhaps a shift in climate or resources made the location less viable. Perhaps the society transformed into a different form of organization. The abandonment itself is a clue that early complex societies in the Americas were not stable, linear progressions. They rose, peaked, and sometimes dissolved, leaving behind stone monuments as their only testament. For centuries, El Paraíso lay hidden under wind-blown sand and scrub vegetation. Local people knew of the mounds, but few realized their age or significance. It was not until the 1960s that archaeologists began systematic excavations. Even then, the site received far less attention than its contemporaries in the Old World. Today, it is protected as a national heritage site, but it remains overshadowed by more famous Inca and pre-Inca ruins. El Paraíso forces us to rethink the global picture of early civilization. At a time when the first cities were emerging in Mesopotamia and the pyramids were rising in Egypt, a parallel world was developing in the Americas, not in isolation but with its own unique solutions to the challenges of social organization. The people of El Paraíso built on a monumental scale without writing, without metal, without wheels. They proved that complexity can take many forms. The story of human achievement is not a single narrative dominated by a few regions. It is a tapestry woven from countless threads, and El Paraíso is one of the strongest. What other threads lie buried along the coast of Peru, waiting to be pulled? More than 14,000 years ago, a group of people built a camp beside a creek in southern Chile. Their shelter was made of wood and animal hides, their tools were stone and bone, and their lives depended on the plants and animals that thrived in a cool, wet landscape. For decades, the dominant story of how humans first entered the Americas centered on the Clovis culture, a people who left distinctive spear points across North America starting around 13,000 years ago. But Monte Verde challenges that narrative at its foundation, pushing the timeline back by at least 1,500 years and shifting the location to the far south of the continent. The site was discovered in the 1970s, and its preservation stunned archaeologists. The waterlogged soil of the creek bank had kept organic materials intact for millennia. Wooden planks, stakes, and remnants of what appear to be hide-covered huts were found in clear association with hearths and tool-making areas. This was not a temporary hunting stop. It was a settled camp, a home where people lived for extended periods. The inhabitants gathered edible plants, fished in nearby streams, and hunted local animals. They left behind a rich collection of tools including stone knives, scrapers, and projectile points, but also wooden implements like digging sticks and lances. Perhaps most remarkable was the discovery of medicinal plants. Fragments of seaweed and other herbs were found near the hearths, some of which are known today for their healing properties. The variety and selection suggest a deep knowledge of local flora, a pharmacopoeia passed down through generations. One species of seaweed found at the site, Dervelia antarctica, only grows in the intertidal zone of the far southern oceans. Its presence implies that these people were familiar with the coast and its resources, even if their camp was some distance inland. This connection to the sea is a critical clue. For a long time, the Clovis first model assumed that the first Americans walked over a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska and then spread south through an ice-free corridor. But Monte Verde, located thousands of miles south of that corridor, is far older than any Clovis site. How could people have arrived so early in southern Chile unless they came by a different route? The most likely alternative is a coastal migration along the Pacific shore, using boats or rafts to move from island to island, following the rich marine resources. Such a journey would have required seafaring skills and knowledge of ocean currents, abilities that were once thought to be later developments. Monte Verde suggests that early Americans were not just big game hunters following herds across the plains. They were adaptable, knowledgeable, and capable of living in diverse environments. The site also reveals social structure. The huts were arranged around a central communal space with separate areas for different activities. One area contained a concentration of animal bones and tools, likely a food preparation zone. Another held a large collection of grinding stones used to process plant materials. The layout implies a group that worked together, shared tasks, and organized their space with intention. For many years, the academic community fiercely debated Monte Verde. Some argued that the organic remains were not truly that old, that contamination had skewed the dating, but repeated testing at multiple laboratories confirmed the age. The wooden artifacts and the sediment layers they were found in date consistently to around 14,500 years ago. Today, Monte Verde is widely accepted as one of the oldest known human settlements in the Americas. Its acceptance did more than just push back a timeline. It opened the door to a whole new understanding of early American prehistory. The site showed that humans were present in South America before the Clovis culture even emerged in North America. It made clear that the peopling of the Americas was not a single wave of migration, but a complex process involving multiple routes, multiple groups, and much more time. The people of Monte Verde were not a lost tribe or an isolated anomaly. They were part of a broader story, one that is still being rewritten with every new dig. What other early campsites might be hidden along the drowned coastlines of the Pacific, submerged by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age? The answer could reshape our understanding of the entire human journey into the Americas. 1,000 miles north of Monte Verde, in the dry cliffs of northeastern Brazil, a discovery has ignited one of the most heated debates in American archaeology. Pedra Furada is a massive rock shelter carved into a sandstone escarpment, a natural overhang that provided shade and protection for thousands of years. But the question of exactly how many thousands of years those walls have sheltered people threatens to overturn everything we thought we knew about when humans first reached the Americas. Excavations at Pedra Furada have uncovered stone tools, charcoal from ancient hearths, and rock paintings that date back tens of thousands of years. The most controversial dates push human occupation back to around 50,000 years ago, more than 35,000 years before the Clovis culture appeared in North America. If these dates are correct, humans were living in South America at a time when much of the northern hemisphere was still locked in the grip of the last ice age, and the land bridge from Siberia to Alaska would not open for another 20,000 years. The implications are staggering. It would mean that the peopling of the Americas was not a single late event but a series of migrations stretching back into the deep past, possibly by boat along the Pacific coast, or perhaps even across the Atlantic, though that idea remains highly speculative. The evidence at Pedra Furada is not flimsy. The rock shelter contains multiple layers of occupation, each one sealed by natural sediment falls from the cliff above. Archaeologists have found quartzite and flint flakes that bear the unmistakable marks of human napping, the deliberate striking of stone to create sharp edges. These are not natural Chinese letter. They show the characteristic bulbs of percussion and striking platforms that only come from intentional tool making. Beneath these layers, excavators found hearths, circular arrangements of stones blackened by fire, with charcoal that has been radiocarbon dated to astonishing ages. Yet mainstream archaeology has been deeply skeptical. Critics argue that the stone tools at Pedra Furada could be natural fragments, broken by the collapse of the cliff or by the pressure of overlying sediment. They point out that no human bones have been found at the site, and that the hearths could be natural fires caused by lightning. The debate has been intense, sometimes even bitter, with both sides accusing the other of ignoring inconvenient evidence. But recent advances in dating techniques have strengthened the case for Pedra Furada. Luminescence dating, which measures when quartz grains were last exposed to sunlight, has been applied to the sediment layers containing the artifacts. The results consistently show ages of 40 to 50,000 years. The rock art at the site adds another layer to the mystery. Thousands of paintings cover the walls, depicting animals, geometric patterns, and human figures in vibrant reds and yellows. Some of these images may be nearly as old as the occupation layers themselves, making them among the oldest known cave paintings in the Americas. They show a people who are not just surviving but expressing themselves, recording their world, perhaps telling stories that have long since faded from memory. The sheer number of paintings layered on top of one another over millennia suggests a continuous cultural tradition that lasted for thousands of years. If Pedra Furada is accepted as genuine, it does more than push back a timeline. It rewrites the entire narrative of human migration. The standard model, in which people walked across a land bridge and then spread south through an ice-free corridor, simply cannot account for humans in Brazil 50,000 years ago. The ice sheets of North America were at their maximum extent at that time, blocking any overland route. The only plausible alternative is a coastal route, with people moving by boat along the shores of the Pacific, perhaps as far south as Tierra del Fuego, and then eventually crossing the Andes into the interior of South America. Such a journey would have required sophisticated seafaring technology and a deep knowledge of ocean currents and marine resources. The resistance to Pedrofiorada is not just about the evidence. It is about the weight of a century-old academic paradigm. The Clovis first model was built on decades of research and thousands of sites. Overturning it requires more than a single site, no matter how well dated. But the evidence has been accumulating. Monte Verde in Chile is now widely accepted. Sites in the United States like Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania and the Paisley Caves in Oregon have pushed back the North American timeline. Pedrofiorada may be the final piece that forces a complete revision of the story. Yet for now, the site remains on the fringe of mainstream acceptance, a controversial and neglected chapter in the unfolding story of human history. The rock shelter still stands, its walls covered in ancient paintings, its floors still holding secrets yet to be excavated. Each new dating test, each new artifact, adds weight to the argument that the first Americans arrived much earlier than we ever imagined. The question is no longer whether humans could have reached South America 50,000 years ago. The question is how many other sites like Pedrofiorada are waiting to be found, and what they will tell us about the resilience, creativity, and sheer endurance of the people who came before us. A different kind of ancient arrival, one that happened nearly 2 million years ago, was uncovered in the rolling hills of the Caucasus region of Georgia. The site of Dmanisi has yielded some of the oldest hominin fossils ever found outside of Africa, dating to roughly 1.8 million years ago. For decades, the story of human evolution followed a neat line. Our ancestors evolved in Africa, developed larger brains and more sophisticated tools, and then gradually spread out of the continent in a single wave around 1 million years ago. Dmanisi shatters that neat picture. The fossils here are not from one type of early human, but from several individuals who show a remarkable range of physical features. Some have small brains and large teeth. Others have more prominent brow ridges or different skull shapes. This diversity challenges the idea that early Homo evolved in a straight line from a single African ancestor. Instead, it suggests that multiple groups with varying characteristics were living and moving through Eurasia far earlier than previously believed. The remains include skulls, jaws, and limb bones, all found in association with simple stone tools and the bones of ancient animals. The tools are primitive, little more than sharp flakes struck from river pebbles, but they represent a technology that allowed these early humans to process meat and plant foods. The animals they hunted or scavenged included deer, horses, and even giant rhinoceroses, creatures that roamed a landscape much warmer and wetter than today. One of the most famous fossils from Dmanisi is a nearly complete skull known as Skull 5. Its small brain size, around 600 cubic centimeters, is roughly half the size of a modern human brain. Yet it belongs to the genus Homo, our own lineage. For a long time, researchers believed that a brain size of over 700 cubic centimeters was necessary before hominins could leave Africa. Dmanisi proves that this threshold was not a barrier. These early people managed to adapt and travel across continents with a brain not much bigger than a modern chimpanzee's. The site shows that the first exodus from Africa was not a single event but a series of movements over hundreds of thousands of years. These pioneers were not the fully modern humans we might imagine. They were short, with long arms and sturdy legs built for walking and climbing. Their technology was basic, but it was enough. They may have moved along coastlines, following rivers, or crossing open grasslands, learning to exploit new foods and endure new climates. Their presence in Georgia so far north and so early complicates every simple model of human expansion. The diversity of skulls at Dmanisi also raises a provocative question. Could it be that some of the later species of early humans, like Homo erectus in Asia or Homo ergaster in Africa, are not separate branches but variations of a single widespread population. If the Dmanisi hominins show that much variation can exist within one group, perhaps the later species are just regional variants of the same adaptable human stock. The implications for the family tree are profound. For generations, textbooks taught that human evolution was a ladder with each step leading to the next. Dmanisi suggests it was more like a bush, with branches and offshoots that mingled and separated. The site remains one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, yet it is often overlooked in popular accounts of human origins. Most people have heard of Lucy in Ethiopia or the Neanderthals in Europe, but few know the name Dmanisi. That is a shame because it offers a humbling perspective. Our ancestors were not always at the top of the food chain. They were survivors, often on the edge of extinction, but their adaptability carried them across continents and through ice ages. The fossils from Dmanisi are not just old bones. They are a record of resilience, a reminder that the human story is far messier and more remarkable than any simple timeline can capture. And if 1.8 million-year-old hominins could reach the Caucasus, what other early human sites might be hidden along the ancient corridors between Africa and Asia? The next discovery we examine pushes even deeper into the past, into a time when the first upright walkers took their tentative steps out of the cradle. In the Jordan Valley, a site called Ubeidiya preserves one of the oldest records of human life outside Africa. Its age, roughly 1.5 million years, places it in the same era as Dmanisi, but in a very different landscape. Where Dmanisi sits in the cool highlands of the Caucasus, Ubeidiya lies along the shores of an ancient lake, a setting that would have been lush and rich in resources. The combination of water, vegetation, and game made it an ideal stopping point for early hominins moving out of Africa along the northern corridor. Excavations at Ubeidiya have uncovered thousands of stone tools, many of them small, sharp flakes and chopping tools typical of the Oldowan tradition, one of the earliest stone tool industries. These are not the refined hand axes that came later. They are simple but effective instruments for cutting meat, scraping hides, and processing plants. The sheer number of tools suggests that hominins spent considerable time here, not just passing through but living, working, and possibly returning seasonally. Alongside the tools, archaeologists found a rich collection of animal bones, including those of elephants, hippos, deer, and saber-toothed cats. The presence of large animals indicates that these early humans were not limited to small prey. They could target or scavenge creatures much larger than themselves, a skill that required planning, cooperation, and knowledge of animal behavior. The location of Ubeidiya is just as important as what was found there. It sits along the Levantine corridor, a natural route connecting Africa with the rest of Asia. For a long time, researchers assumed that early hominins only reached Europe and Asia much later, perhaps around 800,000 years ago. Ubeidiya pushes that date back by 700,000 years, showing that humans or their close ancestors were already roaming the lands east of the Mediterranean during the early Pleistocene. This was not a timid, hesitant expansion. It was a steady spread into new territories driven by curiosity, need, or changing environments. What makes Ubeidiya especially valuable is the diversity of habitats preserved in its layers. The site contains evidence of lakeshore, riverbank, and woodland environments all within a small area. This variety allowed early hominins to experiment with different resources and adapt their strategies. They could fish in the lake, hunt on the plains, and gather plants in the forests. The adaptability implied here is remarkable. These were not creatures locked into a single way of life. They were learning, adjusting, and thriving in a mosaic of landscapes. The tools themselves reveal something about the social lives of these early people. Making a sharp flake from a river pebble is not difficult, but doing it consistently with the right angle and force takes practice. The skill had to be taught and learned. The presence of standardized techniques across many tools suggests a shared knowledge passed from generation to generation. Ubeidiya gives us a glimpse into a culture, not just a collection of individuals. For decades, the story of human expansion out of Africa focused on a single wave around 1 million years ago, led by Homo erectus with its larger brain and more advanced tools. Ubeidiya complicates that picture. It shows that simpler toolmakers with smaller brains and older technologies were already far from their African homeland. The dispersal was not a single heroic journey but a slow, patient seepage, a gradual occupation of new lands by people who were resilient and resourceful. The site reminds us that the pioneers who left Africa were not a single type of human. They were a diverse group of survivors, each one adapted to their own time and place. And if the Jordan Valley holds such rich evidence, what other corridors between continents might still hold the bones and tools of our earliest ancestors, waiting to be uncovered? In a cave on a Moroccan hillside, the story of our own species was rewritten. For decades, the oldest accepted fossils of Homo sapiens came from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, dated to around 200,000 years ago. That gave us a neat timeline for when modern humans first appeared. But Jebel Irhoud, a site in the Atlas Mountains, has pushed that date back by more than 100,000 years to roughly 315,000 years ago. The discovery was not a single bone but a collection of skull fragments, jaws, teeth, and stone tools, all buried in sediment that had accumulated over millennia. The faces of these early humans looked strikingly like our own, with the same flat cheeks, prominent chins, and delicate brow ridges. Yet their brain cases were longer and lower, more elongated than the rounded skulls we carry today. It was as if evolution had already sculpted the front of the face while still working on the back. The tools found alongside them tell a story of skill and adaptation. They are not simple flakes but carefully prepared blades and points, made using a technique known as levallois, which required planning and precision. The people of Jebel Irhoud were not primitive in their thinking. They knapped stone with deliberate intent, producing tools that could be resharpened and reused. They hunted game on the open plains and gathered plants from the surrounding woodlands. They lived in a landscape that was greener than today, with lakes and rivers that supported herds of zebras, wildebeests, and other animals. The significance of Jebel Irhoud extends far beyond a new date on a chart. It shows that the emergence of our species was not a sudden event in a single corner of Africa, but a gradual, continent-wide process. The faces changed first, then the brain case followed later. This mosaic pattern of evolution means that there was no single Garden of Eden where modern humans were born. Instead, populations across Africa were exchanging genes and ideas, slowly converging toward the form we recognize today. The cave at Jebel Irhoud also forces us to reconsider the relationship between anatomy and behavior. These early humans looked almost like us from the front, yet their tools and their way of life were different from what we see in later sites. They were not yet painting caves or crafting elaborate ornaments, but they were capable of complex planning and social cooperation. The line between archaic and modern is blurred. For generations, the story of our origins was told as a short, dramatic chapter. Jebel Irhoud turns that chapter into a long, gradual book. It reminds us that the journey to becoming human was not a quick leap but a slow, patient unfolding, one that took place across an entire continent over hundreds of thousands of years. And if one cave in Morocco can hold such a revelation, what other caves across Africa might still hold the bones of our earliest ancestors, waiting to push the timeline even further back? In the Omo Valley of southern Ethiopia, a different chapter of our origins was written. The site known as Omo Kibish rests along the banks of the Omo River, a region that has preserved layers of volcanic ash and sediment for hundreds of thousands of years. In 1967, a team led by Richard Leakey uncovered 2 skulls and a collection of skeletal fragments that would become some of the most famous fossils in paleoanthropology. These remains, dated to around 195,000 years ago, were at the time the oldest undisputed evidence of Homo sapiens anywhere on Earth. The skulls named Omo I and Omo II show a mix of features that are unmistakably modern: a high forehead, a prominent chin, and a rounded brain case. Yet they also retain some archaic traits, like a more robust brow ridge and a slightly larger face. This blend is exactly what you would expect from a population that was still evolving toward the fully modern form. The dating was achieved using radioactive decay in the volcanic ash layers above and below the fossils, giving researchers a reliable age that has held up for decades. The geological context of Omo Kibish is just as important as the bones themselves. The Omo River has cut deep into the floor of the Great Rift Valley, exposing layers of sediment that record millions of years of environmental change. For the early humans who lived here, the landscape offered abundant resources. The river provided fresh water and fish, the floodplain supported herds of grazing animals, and the surrounding woodlands were rich in edible plants. The tools found alongside the Omo fossils are simple but effective. They include sharp flakes, scrapers, and chopping tools made from local stone, typical of the Middle Stone Age technology that was emerging across Africa at this time. These tools allowed these early people to process meat, prepare hides, and work wood. They were not yet making elaborate art or jewelry, but they were skilled enough to thrive in a dynamic environment. For many years, Omo Kibish stood as the definitive proof that modern humans originated in Eastern Africa around 200,000 years ago. The discovery of older fossils at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco has shifted the timeline back by more than 100,000 years, but it has not diminished the importance of the Omo site. Instead, Omo Kibish remains a key piece of the puzzle, showing that the region of Eastern Africa was not just a birthplace but a persistent center of human evolution. The people who lived here were part of a population that would eventually give rise to all modern humans, spreading across Africa and later the entire world. The site also demonstrates the depth of human presence in the Rift Valley, a landscape that has been home to our ancestors for millions of years. The question of modern behavior is deeply tied to sites like Omo Kibish. Did these early Homo sapiens think and act like us? The evidence suggests they were capable of complex social cooperation and long-term planning, but they did not leave behind the symbolic objects like carved beads or painted shells that appear at later sites. This suggests that the full package of modern behavior, art, ritual, and complex language emerged gradually over tens of thousands of years. Omo Kibish captures a snapshot of that gradual process, a moment when our anatomy was nearly complete but our culture was still developing. For decades, the site has been overshadowed by younger, more spectacular discoveries. The famous cave paintings of Europe, the elaborate burials of the Middle East, and the intricately carved figurines of Siberia all draw more attention. But Omo Kibish remains a foundational site, a quiet anchor for the entire narrative of human origins. It reminds us that Eastern Africa was not just a starting point but a crucible, a region where our ancestors lived, adapted, and evolved through countless generations. The Omo River still flows through its ancient valley, and the sediments along its banks continue to hold secrets. As researchers refine dating techniques and explore deeper layers, it is possible that even older remains will come to light, pushing the story of Homo sapiens in Eastern Africa even further back. For now, Omo Kibish stands as a testament to the enduring importance of this landscape, a place where the roots of our species run deep. On the shores of a dry lake in New South Wales, the remains of an individual have rewritten the story of human arrival on an entire continent. Known today as Mungo Man, these bones are around 42,000 years old, making them among the oldest human remains ever found in Australia. But it is not just their age that matters. It is what they reveal about the people who lived here so long ago. The discovery at Lake Mungo in the 1970s was a watershed moment for archaeology. Before Mungo Man, the accepted timeline for the peopling of Australia hovered around 30,000 years, maybe a little older. This site pushed that timeline back by more than 10,000 years, showing that humans had reached this distant landmass far earlier than anyone suspected. Yet the real surprise came from the way this individual was treated after death. The bones show clear evidence of cremation. The body was burned on a pyre, and then the charred fragments were carefully collected and buried in a shallow grave. This was not a simple disposal. It was a deliberate ritual, a ceremony that required planning, fuel, and a shared understanding of what death meant. The remains were sprinkled with red ochre, a mineral pigment that had to be brought from a source many miles away. That act of bringing ochre to the grave speaks to symbolic thinking, a belief that color and material carried meaning beyond the practical. Mungo Man was not alone. Nearby, another set of remains, known as Mungo Lady, was also cremated and buried with similar care. The two individuals represent some of the earliest known examples of ritual burial anywhere in the world. At a time when people in Europe were still living as hunter-gatherers in the cold landscapes of the Ice Age, these indigenous Australians were already performing complex funerary rites that involved fire, pigment, and intentional placement. The implications are profound. It tells us that the first Australians did not just survive in a new continent. They built cultures with deep spiritual traditions and social structures that allowed them to thrive for tens of thousands of years. The landscape around Lake Mungo was very different back then. It was not the dry, dusty basin we see today. It was a system of freshwater lakes and wetlands, teeming with fish, birds, and marsupials. The people who lived here had rich sources of food and fresh water, and they used the resources with skill and knowledge passed down through generations. They made stone tools, wove baskets, and crafted nets for fishing. They understood the seasons and the movements of animals, and they managed their environment with controlled burns that encouraged new growth. The evidence of ritual burial at this depth of time challenges the old idea that complex culture evolved only in certain parts of the world. It shows that the human capacity for symbolism and ceremony is not tied to agriculture or cities. It is part of our nature, and it emerged wherever people settled. The discovery also forced a re-evaluation of how humans reached Australia. To get here, they had to cross open ocean, even during periods of lowered sea levels. The shortest crossing from Southeast Asia was still more than 50 miles of water. That means the very first Australians were seafarers, people who built rafts or boats and navigated across the horizon. They carried their culture, their tools, and their beliefs with them. Mungo Man is a testament to that journey, a reminder that the peopling of Australia was one of the great feats of human migration. For decades, the remains were held in university collections, a source of tension between the scientific community and indigenous Australian communities who wanted their ancestors returned to the land. Eventually, after years of negotiation and cultural consultation, Mungo Man was reburied at Lake Mungo in 2017, returned to the country that had held him for 40,000 years. That act of repatriation is itself a powerful statement about the living connection between the past and the present. The story of Mungo Man is not just about bones and dates. It is about the depth of human history in Australia, a history that stretches back into the last ice age and weaves through every generation that followed. It challenges the idea that sophisticated social practices emerged late. Instead, it suggests that from the moment humans set foot on this continent, they brought with them a full cultural heritage, one that included rituals, art, and a profound respect for the dead. The shores of Lake Mungo are now a World Heritage Area, but the full extent of what lies buried there is still unknown. How many more individuals, how many more ceremonies, how many more stories are waiting to be uncovered in the dry earth of this ancient landscape? The answer could reshape our understanding of not just Australian history, but the universal human journey. On the Indonesian island of Flores, a discovery shattered the simple story of human evolution. In 2003, archaeologists digging in the limestone cave of Liang Bua uncovered a skeleton that did not look like anything they had ever seen. It was tiny, barely over 3 feet tall, with a skull the size of a grapefruit and long arms that hung down past its hips. The bones belonged to an adult, not a child, and they were dated to just 50,000 years ago, a time when our own species, Homo sapiens, was already spreading across the globe. This was not a modern human with a growth disorder. This was something else. The find was named Homo floresiensis and nicknamed the Hobbit after the small folk in Tolkien's stories. The name stuck because it captured the surprise and wonder of the discovery. The skeleton was complete enough to reveal a whole set of primitive features: a sloping forehead, a chinless jaw, and a brain capacity no larger than that of a chimpanzee. Yet these small people made stone tools, hunted pygmy elephants, and used fire. Their tools were sophisticated, requiring planning and skill. They lived in a world dominated by larger animals and by the constant threat of Komodo dragons, giant lizards that shared the island. The controversy erupted almost immediately. Some researchers argued that the bones were not a new species at all, but the remains of a modern human afflicted by a condition like microcephaly, which causes a small head and brain. Others pointed to the unique anatomy of the wrist, the foot bones, and the shape of the shoulder, all of which matched ancient hominins more closely than any modern human group. The debate was fierce and sometimes personal, but the evidence kept accumulating. Additional skeletons were found, all with the same tiny stature and primitive traits. The pattern was consistent. This was not a disease, it was a population. The implications are profound. For decades, the story of human evolution assumed that Homo sapiens was the last hominin standing, that we alone survived while all other branches died out long ago. Liang Bua shows that at least one other species, Homo floresiensis, was still alive as recently as 50,000 years ago. That means modern humans arriving in Southeast Asia were not alone. They shared the landscape with another thinking, tool-making species. The encounter may have been brief, but it reshapes our understanding of what it means to be human. The existence of the Hobbit forces a broader rethink of human diversity. If a species so different could thrive on a remote island, what other forms of ancient humans might have lived in isolated pockets across the world? The island of Flores acted as a natural laboratory, cut off from the mainland by deep water. Once a small group of early hominins arrived, possibly by raft or by accident, they evolved in isolation. Their small size may have been an adaptation to limited resources, a phenomenon known as island dwarfism that occurs when large animals shrink on small islands. But their small brains, even for their body size, remain a puzzle. How did they make tools and hunt big game with such a small brain? The answer may be that intelligence is not only about brain size, but about how the brain is wired and how knowledge is passed through culture. The team that discovered Homo floresiensis continues to excavate at Liang Bua, uncovering more bones and more tools. Each new find adds depth to the story, but many questions remain. How did the Hobbit first reach Flores? When exactly did they die out? And did they ever meet modern humans face to face? And if so, what happened? The cave still holds secrets, and the mystery of the little people of Flores is far from solved. They challenge the comfortable idea that our species is the sole inheritor of the earth, and remind us that the human family was once much more diverse, much more surprising than we ever imagined. Deep inside a cave system in South Africa, a chamber packed with bones has forced scientists to rethink what it means to be human. The discovery at Rising Star Cave in the Cradle of Humankind region began in 2013 when a narrow, almost vertical passage led explorers into a room they called the Neolithic chamber. What they found there was astonishing. Scattered across the floor and embedded in the sediment were hundreds of fossil fragments, representing at least 15 individuals of a species never seen before. They named it Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin that stood about 4.5 feet tall and weighed around 100 pounds. Their hands and feet were built for climbing and walking, a mix of primitive and modern features that placed them somewhere between the earliest humans and our own lineage. The most startling aspect of Homo naledi is not its anatomy, but what the evidence suggests about its behavior. The bones were not scattered by predators or washed in by floods. They were deliberately placed in this hard-to-reach chamber, deep underground, accessible only through a treacherous squeeze and a climb in near-total darkness. There are no signs of animal gnaw marks, no cut marks from tools, and no scatter patterns that would indicate natural accumulation. The only explanation that fits is that other Homo naledi individuals carried the bodies into this remote space, a deliberate act of disposal that looks very much like a form of mortuary ritual. The implications are profound. For decades, scientists believed that complex burial practices and symbolic treatment of the dead required a large brain, the kind that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals possessed. Yet Homo naledi had a brain barely larger than a grapefruit, around a third the size of ours, and still managed to navigate a dark underground passage, possibly using fire for light, and deposit the remains of their companions in a hidden chamber. This was not a simple discard of a corpse. It required planning, coordination, and a shared understanding that the dead deserved a specific resting place. The dating of the fossils has been a challenge, but recent analysis places Homo naledi between 300,000 and 250,000 years ago. That means these small-brained relatives lived at the same time as early Homo sapiens were emerging in Africa. The two species may have even crossed paths, sharing the same continent at the same moment in deep time. The discovery of Homo naledi has triggered a wave of new questions. Was ritual behavior an ancient trait present in our common ancestor, or did it evolve independently in multiple human lineages? Could other small-brained hominins have practiced similar acts of remembrance, leaving behind evidence that we have not yet recognized? The Rising Star Cave remains an active excavation site, and researchers are still uncovering new chambers and more fossils. Each bone that emerges adds another layer to the story of a species that challenges our assumptions about intelligence and culture. The cavern under the South African earth holds a secret that is not just about one ancient people, but about the very nature of what it means to be human. And if Homo naledi could perform such deliberate acts with such a small brain, what other capabilities might lie hidden in the minds of our distant relatives? Just a few kilometers from the famous mounds of Göbekli Tepe, another ancient ceremonial center has been slowly emerging from the earth. Its name is Karahan Tepe, and it is changing the way archaeologists understand the very first temples. While Göbekli Tepe has captured the world's imagination, Karahan Tepe has remained in its shadow, quietly waiting for the attention it deserves. The two sites share the same era, the pre-pottery Neolithic, a time roughly 11,000 years ago when humans were just beginning to experiment with farming and living in permanent settlements. But Karahan Tepe holds its own astonishing secrets. Excavators have uncovered T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, just like those at Göbekli Tepe. The pillars are carved with animal figures, abstract symbols, and human-like forms, some with detailed hands and fingers etched into the stone. The resemblance is so striking that it is clear these two sites were not isolated projects. They were part of something larger, a network of shared beliefs and building traditions spanning dozens of miles across the hills of southeastern Turkey. What makes Karahan Tepe especially significant is that it is only partially excavated. Much of the site still lies beneath accumulated soil and rubble, hinting at a complexity we have only begun to glimpse. Even in its incomplete state, the scale is impressive. The main enclosure measures roughly 50 feet across, with pillars standing up to 16 feet tall. The builders transported these massive stone blocks from nearby quarries, shaped them with flint tools, and erected them in precise alignments, all without metal or the wheel. The effort required suggests a society that could organize hundreds of people over many generations, a level of coordination that challenges the old view that complex social life only emerged after the invention of agriculture. Instead, Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe together suggest that the drive to build monumental religious centers came first, and that this shared spiritual project may have been the very force that brought scattered hunter-gatherer groups together, eventually leading to settled villages and farming. The implications for the early cult network are profound. These were not rival temples competing for followers. They were likely part of a regional system where pilgrimages, festivals, and exchanges of knowledge connected communities across the landscape. The consistency in pillar style and enclosure design points to a common symbolic language, a way of thinking about the cosmos that was shared by many groups. This is not a single isolated genius site, but the remains of an entire religious landscape. The question now is how many more Karahan Tepe-like sites lie hidden under the dry soil of the Turkish countryside. Each new discovery adds weight to the idea that the Neolithic revolution was not a quiet shift from hunting to farming, but a dramatic social and spiritual transformation that began in the hills and spread outward. Karahan Tepe is a reminder that the story of early civilization is not written in one place but in many, and that the most important chapters are often the ones we have not yet fully read. In the Jordan Valley, a village called Tel Tsaf stored grain on a scale never seen before. The site dates back roughly 7,000 years, a time when most communities in the region still lived in small, egalitarian groups. Yet here, archaeologists uncovered a series of massive storage silos, each one large enough to hold several tons of barley and wheat. These were not simple pits dug into the ground. They were carefully constructed mud brick chambers, plastered to keep out moisture and pests, with raised floors to allow air to circulate. The sheer volume of grain they held far exceeded what the local population could have eaten in a single year. Someone was collecting, controlling, and redistributing food on a scale that hinted at a system of authority and surplus management long before the first cities of Mesopotamia rose. The silos themselves tell a story of planning and social organization. Building them required coordinated labor, a steady supply of raw materials, and a shared understanding that the harvest would be stored communally. But who decided how the grain was distributed? Who made sure the silos were filled and maintained? The presence of such infrastructure suggests that a group of leaders, perhaps elders or emerging chiefs, had taken on the role of managing resources. This is one of the earliest signs of what we would later call bureaucracy, a system of tracking, storing, and allocating goods. Even more striking is the evidence of long-distance trade. Among the artifacts found at Tel Tsaf were obsidian blades from central Anatolia, hundreds of miles to the north. The only way that shiny black volcanic glass could have reached the Jordan Valley was through a network of exchange that connected distant regions. Alongside the obsidian, excavators found seashells from the Mediterranean coast, as well as copper ore from sources in the Negev or even the Sinai. these materials did not arrive by accident. They were sought after, carried across mountains and deserts, and traded for goods that the people of Tel Tsaf produced, perhaps grain, textiles, or bitumen. The trade network was not a simple barter between neighboring villages. It was organized and extensive, requiring trust, communication, and a shared system of value. The presence of copper ore is especially telling. Copper was not yet widely smelted into metal tools in this region at the time. The ore may have been valued as a pigment or as a raw material for small ornaments. But its journey from faraway mines to this small village in the Jordan Valley shows that people were already reaching out across the landscape, building connections that would later grow into the great trade routes of the Bronze Age. Perhaps the most intriguing find at Tel Tsaf is a set of small clay objects, roughly the size of a finger, that appear to carry markings. Some researchers believe these could be early examples of proto-writing, symbols used to record numbers, quantities, or ownership. The markings are simple, lines and notches pressed into the clay before firing, but they suggest a need to keep track of information beyond what memory could hold. If these are indeed early accounting tokens, they represent a step toward the kind of record-keeping that would later blossom into full writing systems in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The combination of large-scale storage, long-distance trade, and symbolic record-keeping paints a picture of a society far more complex than the simple farming village it might appear to be at first glance. Tel Tsaf challenges the assumption that social hierarchy and economic specialization only emerged after the rise of the first cities in the Fertile Crescent around 5,000 years ago. Here, 2,000 years earlier, a community in the Jordan Valley had already developed a system that required leaders, traders, and record-keepers. The silos stood as monuments not just to grain, but to a new way of organizing human life, one built on surplus, exchange, and the power that comes from controlling resources. For a long time, the standard narrative of early civilization emphasized the urban revolutions of Mesopotamia with their temples, kings, and writing. Tel Tsaf shows that the seeds of that revolution were planted much earlier and in a different kind of setting, a small village whose inhabitants were already thinking in terms of trade, storage, and symbols. The site is a window into a moment when human society was quietly transforming itself, laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. And if one village could achieve this level of complexity 7,000 years ago, what other settlements across the ancient world might have been experimenting with similar systems? Their remains still hidden beneath the soil. In the Kaba River basin, a city rose long before the famous names of Mesopotamia. Tel Brak, located in what is now northeastern Syria, was already a bustling urban center around 4000 BCE, at a time when the great cities of southern Mesopotamia, like Uruk, were still centuries away from their golden age. This was not a small village gradually growing. It was a planned metropolis with monumental temples, mass-produced pottery, and a population that may have numbered in the thousands. The scale of the site is staggering. Excavators have uncovered layers of occupation that span more than 1,000 years, with each generation building on top of the previous one, raising the tell higher and higher above the surrounding plain. One of the most remarkable structures at Tel Brak is the Eye Temple, named for the thousands of small carved stone idols shaped like human eyes that were found within its walls. These objects were not unique or one of a kind. They were manufactured in bulk with identical designs and standardized sizes, suggesting a system of organized production that supplied worshippers with devotional items. The temple itself was built on a massive platform, its walls decorated with cone-shaped mosaics and its entrance flanked by stone lions. This was not a simple shrine for a local community. This was a regional religious center, a place where people from across the Kaba Basin came to offer gifts and participate in ceremonies. The presence of mass-produced artifacts tells us something important. It indicates a level of economic specialization and central planning that we usually associate with later cities. Someone was organizing the extraction of raw materials, the training of craftsmen, and the distribution of finished goods across a wide area. Trade also flourished at Tel Brak. Excavators have found obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and seashells from the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. These were not accidental arrivals. They were the result of long-distance exchange networks that connected this northern city to lands thousands of miles away. Such trade required trust, communication, and a system of value that all parties understood. It also required a surplus of goods to trade. Tel Brak produced grain, wool, and textiles, as well as the stone vessels and beads that were carried to distant markets. The implications for the urban revolution are profound. For decades, the standard narrative held that the first cities emerged in the fertile floodplains of southern Mesopotamia, with Uruk as the birthplace of urban life. Tel Brak shows that this was not a single origin but a parallel development. The north was not a backwater waiting for ideas to arrive from the south. It was an independent center of innovation, with its own solutions to the challenges of organizing a complex society. The growth of Tel Brak predates the rise of Uruk by several centuries, pushing the date of the urban revolution back and spreading its geography across a much wider region. This discovery forces us to ask a deeper question. If cities could emerge independently in the Khabar Basin, where else might they have appeared? The conventional timeline of civilization, with its neat progression from village to town to city, may be hiding a much messier, more interconnected reality. The people of Tel Brak were not waiting for a blueprint from the south. They were building their own world, one temple, one trade route, one standardized idol at a time. And when the famous cities of Sumer finally began to rise, they were entering a landscape that already knew what a city looked like. What other urban centers from this early age are still buried beneath the deserts of Syria and Iraq, waiting to reshape our understanding of where and when human civilization truly began? In the dry plains of northeastern Syria, another ancient city has emerged from the earth, one that challenges the standard story of how urban life began. This settlement, known today as Hamoukar, flourished around 3500 BCE, at a time when the famous temple cities of southern Mesopotamia were still finding their footing. But Hamoukar was not built around a grand religious center. Its layout tells a different story, one of secular planning, trade, and conflict. Archaeologists have uncovered a sprawling urban site with carefully arranged streets, residential neighborhoods, and industrial quarters dedicated to mass production. The scale is impressive. The city covered well over 50 acres with evidence of dense occupation and organized space. People here were not just farmers gathering around a temple. They were craftsmen, merchants, and administrators living in a community that managed its own affairs. The discovery of thousands of clay objects, including tokens, seals, and seal impressions, points to a sophisticated system of record-keeping and administration. These small artifacts were used to track goods, mark ownership, and verify transactions, a bureaucratic toolkit that allowed the city to function at a scale far beyond a simple village. The seal impressions are especially telling. They bear intricate designs, geometric patterns, and animal motifs that likely identified individuals, families, or institutions. The sheer number of these impressions found in a single area suggests a central administrative hub where goods were received, stored, and redistributed. This was not a temple economy where priests controlled all resources. Instead, it appears that secular leaders, perhaps merchants or local chiefs, managed the flow of goods and wealth. Hamoukar offers a glimpse of a city driven by trade and commerce, where power came from control over exchange, not from religious authority. Then came the destruction. Excavators found layers of ash and collapsed mud brick walls, along with thousands of clay sling bullets and fragments of stone projectiles. The evidence points to a violent event that brought the city down around 3,500 years before our era. The walls were breached, buildings burned, and the administrative center was abandoned. This was not a slow decline but a sudden, devastating conflict. The presence of so many weapons suggests a coordinated attack, possibly by an outside force or perhaps internal strife. The destruction layer is thick and unmistakable. It marks a turning point, a moment when the secular order of Hamoukar was violently overturned. For a long time, the dominant model of early cities assumed that they grew around temples, with religious leaders directing labor, collecting tribute, and organizing society. The priest-king was seen as the essential figure. Hamoukar challenges that assumption. Here, the evidence points to a city where administration, trade, and conflict were the driving forces, not ritual and worship. The clay tokens and seals speak to a practical, worldly kind of power, the power to count, to record, and to control resources. The destruction speaks to the risks that came with that power, the vulnerability of a city built on commerce and competition. The site also forces us to reconsider the geography of urban origins. Southern Mesopotamia has long held the spotlight, with its cities like Uruk and celebrated as the cradles of civilization. Hamoukar, far to the north in the Kaba River basin, shows that urbanism was not a single invention radiating outward. It emerged independently in multiple regions, each with its own character. The people of Hamoukar were not copying a southern blueprint. They were building their own kind of city, one that answered the needs of their own time and place. Today, Hamoukar lies in ruins, its walls toppled, its workshops silent. But the thousands of clay objects that survive offer a voice from a distant age, a reminder that the first cities were not just places of worship and kingship. They were also places of trade, of administration, and of conflict. The urban revolution was not a peaceful unfolding of temple ceremonies. It was a messy, competitive process full of innovation and risk. And Hamoukar is one of its most vivid witnesses. What other secular cities from this early period might be hidden beneath the sands, waiting to show us a different face of the ancient world? 1,000 miles east of the Kaba Basin, another buried city has been quietly challenging the map of early civilization. In the Halil River Valley of southeastern Iran, archaeologists have uncovered remnants of a culture that flourished around 2700 BCE, a society that produced some of the most exquisite art of the ancient world and left behind a writing system that still refuses to give up its secrets. This is Jiroft, a name that has slowly been forcing a revision of how we understand the entire ancient Near East. For generations, the standard story placed Mesopotamia at the very center of early civilization, with Iran portrayed as a peripheral zone, a source of raw materials and an occasional trading partner. Jiroft shatters that assumption completely. The scale and sophistication of what has been found here point to a culture that was not a distant echo of Sumer, but a powerful civilization in its own right, one that may have influenced its neighbors as much as it was influenced by them. The artifacts recovered from the site are stunning. Carved stone vessels, some elaborately decorated with scenes of animals, mythical creatures, and human figures that seem to move across the surface, have been unearthed by the hundreds. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, showing a mastery of hard stone that required specialized tools and generations of accumulated skill. These were not simple household items. They were works of art created for ritual use, for display, or for trade, and they traveled far from their place of origin. Similar vessels have been found as far away as Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, suggesting that Jiroft was a major hub in a vast exchange network that connected distant lands. Then there is the architecture. Excavators have uncovered massive platforms, stepped structures, and what appears to be a citadel complex that dominated the valley. The layout speaks to a society with organized labor, engineering knowledge, and a clear hierarchical structure. This was not a small village growing organically over time. It was a planned center of power with buildings designed to project authority and to accommodate large gatherings of people for ceremonies, markets, or decisions that affected the entire community. The builders worked on a monumental scale, moving earth and stone in quantities that required coordination over many months and across many work groups. The writing system is perhaps the most intriguing puzzle of all. Seals and inscribed objects bear a script that has not yet been deciphered. The symbols are unlike cuneiform, unlike the Indus script, unlike anything else known from the period. Some researchers believe this script could represent a language isolate, a unique tongue spoken only in this valley and preserved nowhere else. Others see connections to the Elamite language found further west, but the debate continues without resolution. The very existence of a writing system places Jiroft among the literate civilizations of the ancient world, a select club that includes Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. A society that could record its language in symbols was capable of keeping records, telling stories, and transmitting knowledge across generations in ways that oral tradition alone could not match. The fact that we cannot read these symbols yet only adds to the mystery and the allure. The implications of Jiroft are profound. If this was a literate, urban, and artistically advanced civilization at the same time as the great city-states of Sumer, then the map of early civilization must be redrawn. The Iranian plateau was not a passive recipient of ideas flowing from the West. It was a creative center in its own right, a place where people developed their own solutions to the challenges of building a complex society. The trade networks that connected Jiroft to Mesopotamia, to the Indus, and to the Persian Gulf show that this was not an isolated phenomenon, but a full participant in a web of exchange that spanned thousands of miles. Goods moved, ideas traveled, and communities learned from one another in a conversation that crossed mountains and deserts. For years, Jiroft was overlooked, its significance downplayed by scholars who assumed that anything of value must have come from Mesopotamia. The artifacts that surfaced on the antiquities market were dismissed by some as forgeries or as imports from the West, but systematic excavations have proven otherwise. The layers of occupation are clear, the dating is consistent, and the artistic style is distinct and original. Jiroft is real, and its story is still being uncovered. Every new digging season brings more carved vessels, more seal impressions, more fragments of that unreadable script. The valley of the Halil River holds a civilization that was not a footnote but a chapter, and as the earth gives up its secrets, the picture of our shared ancient past grows richer and more complex. What else might lie beneath the soil of the Iranian plateau, waiting to challenge the assumptions we have carried for so long? In the heart of the Karahan desert, a fortified city once stood as a beacon of Central Asian power. Its name was Gonur Tepe, and for centuries it was completely unknown to the outside world. Today, it is emerging as one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A capital that reshapes our understanding of the ancient world from the Indus to the Mediterranean. Around 2,300 years before our era, this city was the center of a culture known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, a civilization that built massive mud-brick fortifications, towering temples, and an elaborate system of canals that brought water from distant rivers into the dry plains. The walls of Gonur Tepe were not simple barriers. They were engineering marvels rising over 30 feet high and fortified with towers and bastions that required thousands of tons of earth and brick. Inside those walls, a planned city unfolded with residential quarters, workshops, and ceremonial spaces arranged around a central citadel. The scale is breathtaking. The main complex covers over 50 acres with a palace, a temple, and storage facilities that could hold enough grain to feed a large population for months. The people of Gonur Tepe were not isolated farmers scratching a living from the desert. They were part of a vast trade network that connected them to the Indus Valley, to Mesopotamia, and to the Iranian Plateau. Evidence of this contact appears in the form of artifacts that traveled thousands of miles. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus region, and shells from the Persian Gulf have all been found within the city's ruins. In return, the craftsmen of Gonur Tepe produced intricate bronze tools, finely woven textiles, and stone vessels that were prized across the ancient world. The metalworkers here were especially skilled. They smelted copper and tin to create bronze alloys, casting tools, weapons, and ornaments with a precision that rivals later civilizations. The raw materials for this metallurgy came from distant mines in the surrounding mountains, and the finished goods were traded far and wide. This was not a peripheral backwater. It was a manufacturing and trading hub at the center of a web that stretched from the Indus to the Euphrates. The religious life of Gonur Tepe is visible in its temples and in the artifacts left behind. Archaeologists have uncovered altars, fire pits, and ritual vessels that suggest a form of worship centered on fire and water, elements that were essential for survival in the arid environment. The temple complex included a central courtyard surrounded by rooms that may have been used for storage of offerings or for housing priests. One of the most remarkable finds was a large basin lined with stone, possibly used for ritual purification or for collecting water as part of a ceremony. The presence of such a structure shows that the people saw their spiritual and practical lives as deeply connected. The irrigation system that sustained Gonur Tepe was an achievement in its own right. The city lay in a region that receives only a few inches of rain each year. To support a population of several thousand, the inhabitants built a network of canals stretching for miles, drawing water from the Murghab River and distributing it across the fields. This required surveying, engineering, and a social system that could organize the labor for construction and maintenance. The canals were not small ditches. They were substantial channels lined with stone and clay that turned the surrounding desert into fertile farmland. This infrastructure allowed the city to produce enough grain to support its population and to generate a surplus for trade. For decades, the standard narrative of early civilization centered on the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley, with Central Asia treated as a quiet corridor between them. Gonur Tepe demolishes that view. It shows that the region was a vibrant and independent center of innovation, a place where people developed their own forms of urban life, their own artistic traditions, and their own connections to the wider world. The Bmak was not a minor offshoot of Mesopotamian or Indus influence. It was a civilization that stood on equal footing with its own kings, its own gods, and its own ambitious vision of what a city could be. The ruins of Gonur Tepe were first identified in the 1970s, but systematic excavations did not begin until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union opened the region to international research. What has been uncovered so far is only a fraction of the site. Deep beneath the wind-blown sand, entire neighborhoods, workshops, and burial grounds are still waiting to be explored. Each new season of digging adds layers to the story of a city that was once a crossroads of the ancient world. The legacy of Gonur Tepe challenges the idea that civilization flowed in a single direction from the Near East outward. Here, in the heart of the desert, people were building cities, forging metal, trading across continents, and practicing sophisticated rituals at the same time as their contemporaries in Sumer and the Indus Valley. The web of ancient civilizations was not a simple network with a single center. It was a complex, interconnected system with multiple hubs, and Gonur Tepe was one of its brightest stars. As the sand continues to yield its secrets, the story of this forgotten capital is only beginning to be told. In the Sichuan basin of southern China, a discovery in 1929 would eventually force historians to rethink the entire foundation of Chinese civilization. For decades, the story of ancient China followed a neat line from the Yellow River Valley, from the Shang dynasty with its bronze vessels and oracle bones to the Zhou and beyond. But Sanxingdui, buried in the alluvial soils near the city of Guanghan, holds artifacts that belong to no known tradition and speak of a culture that was entirely separate from the mainstream. The first hints emerged when a local farmer uncovered a jade and stone cache while digging a well. But it was not until the 1980s that large-scale excavations revealed two massive pits filled with objects that defied explanation. Bronze masks with bulging eyes, elongated faces, and wide, grimacing mouths stared out from the earth. Some masks were larger than a human head, designed to be hung or mounted, perhaps on poles or structures. Their features were not naturalistic. They were deliberately exaggerated, with protruding pupils and angular brows that gave them an otherworldly appearance. Alongside the masks, excavators found complete human figures cast in bronze, standing over 8 feet tall, with slender bodies, large hands, and intricate headdresses. These statues were not warriors or kings in any familiar sense. They seemed to represent priests, deities, or mythical beings, figures from a cosmology we can only guess at. The craftsmanship was astonishing. The bronze casting technique used at Sanxingdui was as advanced as anything produced by the Shang dynasty to the north, but the style was radically different. Shang bronzes are known for their intricate geometric patterns, touty masks, and ritual vessels. Sanxingdui bronzes are bold, surreal, and expressive, with a theatrical quality that suggests a completely different set of beliefs and artistic conventions. The pits also contained gold artifacts, including a long gold scepter or wand, gold foil masks, and thin sheets of gold decorated with patterns. This abundance of gold is notable because the Shang dynasty used very little of it, preferring bronze and jade. The people of Sanxingdui clearly valued gold in ways that set them apart from their contemporaries. There was also a large cache of ivory, tusks from elephants that once roamed the region, and thousands of cowrie shells, a form of currency that linked this culture to trade networks reaching all the way to the Indian Ocean. The scale of the deposits is staggering. The pits held hundreds of bronze objects, tons of ivory, and hundreds of gold items, all deliberately broken, burned, and buried. This was not a hoard of treasure hidden by fleeing inhabitants. It was a ritual act of destruction and burial, a ceremonial closing of a sacred space. The objects were not simply discarded. They were shattered, twisted, and scorched before being laid in the earth in careful layers. This suggests a profound event, perhaps a religious renewal, a change of dynasty, or a deliberate erasure of the old order. The culture that created Sanxingdui left behind no written records. Not a single inscription has been found at the site that can be read. The oracle bones of the Shang to the north provide us with names of kings, records of battles, and questions posed to ancestors, but the people of Sanxingdui remain silent. Their language, their beliefs, and their history are known only through the objects they left behind. This absence of writing makes them a mystery, a civilization that existed alongside the Shang but followed a completely different path. The dating of the site places its peak around the 12th to 11th century BCE, right in the middle of the Shang dynasty. Yet the art, religion, and social organization evident at Sanxingdui have no parallel in the Shang world. The bronze masks and figures suggest a form of worship centered on eyes, sight, and perhaps a sky or sun deity. The emphasis on vision is so strong that some scholars have speculated that the culture valued spiritual sight above all else, a focus on seeing the divine that was expressed in their most important rituals. Then, around the 11th century BC, the city was abruptly abandoned. There are no signs of gradual decline, no layers of deterioration. The pits were sealed, the inhabitants left, and the site was forgotten for 3,000 years. What caused this sudden end is unknown. Invasion, environmental change, internal collapse, all are possible, but the silence is complete. The people of Sanxingdui vanished, leaving behind only their strange and beautiful objects as a testament to their existence. For a long time, the traditional narrative of ancient China placed the Shang dynasty at the center, with the Yellow River Valley as the sole cradle of Chinese civilization. Sanxingdui forces a revision of that story. It shows that a parallel civilization, equally sophisticated but entirely distinct, flourished in the Yangtze River region to the south. The relationship between these two cultures is still being debated. Were they enemies, trading partners, or something else entirely? The lack of written records leaves the relationship open to interpretation, but what is clear is that ancient China was not a single stream. It was a network of interacting cultures, some of which developed along lines very different from the familiar Shang model. The finds at Sanxingdui have also pushed back the timeline for bronze working in the region. Before these excavations, the earliest bronze objects in Sichuan were thought to date to around the 5th century BCE. Sanxingdui shows that sophisticated bronze casting was happening here more than 6 centuries earlier. This is not a minor adjustment. It rewrites the technological history of southern China and raises questions about how knowledge of metalworking spread. Did it travel from the Yellow River Valley, or did it develop independently in multiple centers? The masks and statues of Sanxingdui remain some of the most striking artifacts ever found in China. They do not look like anything else from the ancient world. Their haunting faces and exaggerated features have captivated the imagination of everyone who sees them. They are a reminder that history is not a straight line but a branching tree, with branches that sometimes grow in directions we could never predict. The pit of broken treasures at Sanxingdui was a deliberate act of closure, a society that chose to bury its most sacred objects and then walk away. What caused that decision is lost to time. But the objects themselves, with their silent, staring faces, continue to speak across the millennia, asking us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. On the Peruvian coast, an ancient city rose alongside the pyramids of Egypt. Caral, built around 2,600 years before our era, is now recognized as the oldest urban center in the Americas. Its discovery has quietly overturned a long-held assumption that complex society in the New World was a late bloomer, a copycat waiting for inspiration to arrive from across the ocean. The site sprawls across a dry terrace overlooking the Soup Valley, a landscape that receives almost no rain yet once supported a thriving population. What they built here is staggering in its ambition. 6 massive platform mounds, each one a step pyramid faced with stone and plaster, dominate the skyline. The largest of them, the Pyramid Maya, rises nearly 100 feet above the plain and spans an area larger than several football fields. To construct it, workers hauled millions of cubic feet of rock and earth, shaping blocks with stone tools and carrying them by hand. There were no draft animals, no wheels, no metal. Everything depended on human labor, organized across generations. The layout of Caral reveals careful planning. The pyramids are arranged around a large central plaza, a sunken circular space that could have held thousands of people for public ceremonies. Smaller structures, including residential compounds and storage rooms, cluster nearby. Archaeologists have also uncovered an amphitheater, a sunken court with stepped seating that could accommodate an audience. This was not a simple farming village. It was a ceremonial and administrative center, a place where leaders directed rituals, managed resources, and brought communities together from across the region. One of the most remarkable finds at Caral is a set of knotted cords, fragments of what appears to be a recording system very similar to the later quipus used by the Inca. These cords, made from cotton and plant fibers, have knots tied in patterns that likely represented numbers, quantities, or categories of goods. For a long time, the quipu was thought to be a relatively late invention, perfected by the Inca around the 15th century. Caral shows that the basic idea of using knotted strings for record keeping is at least 4,000 years older. This is not a small detail. It suggests that the people of Caral had developed a method for tracking information, perhaps for managing trade or organizing labor, centuries before writing systems appeared in other parts of the world. The implications of Caral go far beyond its architecture and technology. For decades, a widely held theory known as diffusionism argued that the idea of civilization spread from a single source, usually the ancient Near East, across the globe. According to that view, the pyramids of Egypt and Mesopotamia were the models, and any similar structures elsewhere must have been copied by travelers or migrants. Caral demolishes that theory completely. Here, in the Andes, a society built monumental pyramids and organized a complex urban life at exactly the same time as the Old World civilizations were flourishing. There was no contact across the Atlantic. The people of Caral developed their own solutions to the challenges of building a society, their own engineering, their own calendar, their own system of record-keeping. The city also challenges the idea that agriculture had to come first. The inhabitants of Caral did not rely heavily on domesticated crops. They fished the rich waters of the Pacific, harvested wild plants from the river valley, and traded with inland communities for cotton and other goods. Their diet was based on anchovies, sardines, and shellfish, supplemented by squash, beans, and a few other cultivated plants. This marine foundation provided a stable food supply that freed people to work on construction and administration. Caral shows that the path to urbanism can take many forms, not all of them following the familiar grain-based model of the Fertile Crescent. The site was first identified in 1948, but it was not until the 1990s that systematic excavations revealed its true age. For years, the academic community was skeptical. The dates seemed too early, the complexity too advanced for the Americas, but repeated radiocarbon testing on organic material from the site, including reed mats and plant fibers, consistently returned dates around 2600 BC. Today, Caral is widely accepted and recognized as an UNESCO World Heritage Site, yet it remains far less known than the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. The silence of Caral is part of its power. There are no grand inscriptions, no royal tombs filled with gold, no dramatic stories of conquest. What remains is the quiet testimony of stone and earth, of walls that still stand after 4,000 years, of a plaza that once echoed with the footsteps of a civilization that built its own destiny. The people of Caral did not need a king or an army to organize their world. They created a society based on cooperation, trade, and shared belief, and they left behind a city that asks us to reconsider the very meaning of civilization. What other cities like Caral might be hidden along the coast of the Americas, their pyramids and plazas waiting to be uncovered? The answer could reshape the map of our shared human story, showing that the spark of urban life ignited independently in more than one cradle, in more than one continent, at more than one moment in deep time. The silence from the Soup Valley speaks louder than any inscription, reminding us that the roots of civilization are far older and far more widespread than we ever dared to imagine. One such site, Sechin Bajo, predates even Caral by nearly 1,000 years. Located in the coastal Casma Valley of northern Peru, this ceremonial center holds a plaza that was built around 3,500 years before our era, making it the oldest known public space in the entire Americas. The stone platform, mounds, and carved reliefs that surround it push back the timeline for Andean civilization far earlier than most scholars ever imagined. The plaza itself is a sunken circular court, roughly 40 feet in diameter, lined with carefully cut stone blocks. Its floor was made of compacted clay, and its walls were decorated with carved images of warriors, mythological creatures, and geometric patterns. The most famous of these carvings is a series of figures that appear to be holding hands or weapons, their faces staring out with flat, stylized expressions. The stonework is not crude. It is precise and deliberate, showing a mastery of masonry that required planning and skilled labor. The builders quarried the stone, shaped it with harder stones, and fitted it together without mortar, a technique that would become a hallmark of later Andean cultures like the Chavin and the Inca. What makes Sechin Bajo so significant is not just its age, but the evidence it provides of social organization. To construct a plaza of this size and quality, a community had to coordinate its efforts over multiple seasons. Someone had to decide where to build, how to align the structure, and who would do the work. This implies a level of leadership and shared purpose that we usually associate with much later societies. The site also contains several platform mounds, raised earthen structures that served as stages for ceremonies or as foundations for elite residences. The largest mound rises over 30 feet high and spans an area the size of a modern city block. Building it required moving tens of thousands of tons of earth and stone, all by hand. The presence of these mounds suggests that Sechin Bajo was not just a gathering place for a few local families. It was a regional center, a place where people from surrounding villages came together for rituals, festivals, and perhaps for trade. For decades, the standard narrative of Andean civilization began with the Chavin culture around 1200 BCE. Sechin Bajo pushes that starting point back by more than 2,000 years, showing that the roots of complex society in the Andes run much deeper than anyone suspected. The people who built this plaza were not waiting for inspiration from elsewhere. They developed their own forms of monumental architecture, their own artistic conventions, and their own system of social hierarchy. The carvings at Sechin Bajo are especially important because they offer a glimpse into the beliefs and values of this early culture. The figures depicted are not smiling or peaceful. They are stern and powerful, with weapons in their hands. Some researchers interpret these carvings as evidence of a warrior elite, a society where status was tied to military prowess. Others see them as mythological scenes, representations of gods or ancestors who protected the community. Whatever the exact meaning, the carvings show that the people of Sechin Bajo thought in symbolic terms, using art to communicate ideas about power, identity, and the supernatural. The site was first excavated in the 1930s, but it was not until the early 2000s that modern dating techniques revealed its true antiquity. Radiocarbon tests on organic material from the plaza floor confirmed that it was built around 3500 BCE, making it contemporary with the earliest city-states of Sumer and the first dynasties of Egypt. This discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. For a long time, the idea of parallel development, of civilizations rising independently on different continents at the same time, was treated with skepticism. Sechin Bajo added powerful new evidence to the case that the Americas were not a late arrival to the world of complex societies. The site also challenges the assumption that monumental construction required agriculture. The inhabitants of Sechin Bajo relied heavily on marine resources, fishing the rich waters of the Pacific and gathering shellfish from the coast. They also cultivated some crops, including cotton and gourds, but their diet was far from the grain-based agriculture that supported the Old World civilizations. This marine foundation allowed them to build permanent settlements, accumulate surplus, and invest labor in large-scale projects, all without the heavy dependence on farming that the traditional model of civilization assumed. Today, Sechin Bajo is recognized as a key piece of the puzzle, a site that forces us to rewrite the early history of the Andean region. yet it remains relatively unknown outside of specialist circles, overshadowed by the later and more spectacular ruins of Machu Picchu and the Nazca Lines. The plaza lies open to the sky, its carved stones weathered by millennia of sun and wind. It stands as a quiet reminder that the story of human achievement in the Americas is not a short one. It is a long, deep story, and Sechin Bajo is one of its earliest chapters. The site speaks not of kings or empires, but of communities coming together to build something that would outlast them, a place where the rituals of a people still echo across the centuries. What other plazas and platforms might be hidden in the valleys of the Andes, waiting to push the timeline even further back into the dawn of civilization? The answers lie beneath the soil, and each new discovery adds another layer to the rich and complex tapestry of our shared human past. High in the mountains of Oaxaca, a city was built that rewrites Mesoamerican history. Monte Albán, founded by the Zapotec people around 500 years before the Common Era, sits on a flattened mountaintop overlooking 3 valleys. This was not a small ceremonial center. It was a planned urban capital with a grand plaza, pyramidal platforms, and a remarkable building that served as an observatory, its walls aligned to track the movements of the stars. The structure known as Building J is set at an angle different from every other building on the site, a deliberate deviation that allowed its windows to frame the rising of specific celestial bodies during key times of the year. This level of astronomical knowledge built into stone tells us that the Zapotec were not just farmers living in scattered villages. They were thinkers, engineers, and keepers of a calendar that guided their agriculture, their rituals, and their understanding of the cosmos. Perhaps the most important legacy of Monte Albán is its writing system. Carved into stone slabs throughout the site are hundreds of hieroglyphic inscriptions, some of the earliest known in the Americas. These glyphs record dates, names of places, and events, including conquests and the consolidation of power. The famous danzantes, or dancers, are a set of carved figures that show individuals in various poses, some of which may represent captives or tribute bearers. The figures are not meant to be realistic portraits. They are symbolic, telling stories about the reach of the city and its rulers. The existence of this writing system, independent of any outside influence, challenges the common narrative that only the Maya and the great city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico were capable of advanced intellectual achievements in Mesoamerica. The Zapotec were developing their own form of written expression at roughly the same time as the Maya, and they did it on a mountaintop in Oaxaca, far from the lowland jungles where Maya glyphs would later emerge. The political system of Monte Albán is equally striking. Unlike many early states that were dominated by a single king with absolute power, the Zapotec capital shows evidence of shared governance. Monumental buildings were arranged around plazas that could hold large gatherings, perhaps for councils or public decision-making. Artifacts and inscriptions suggest that authority was distributed among a class of nobles and priests, rather than concentrated in one individual. This model of collective leadership was a different path to political complexity, one that flourished for centuries. For a long time, the story of ancient Mexico focused on the Maya and the great pyramid builders of Teotihuacan. Monte Albán stands as a quiet but powerful counterpoint, a civilization that built its own way with its own script, its own gods, and its own vision of how a city should be governed. The stone glyphs on the walls of this mountain city are still being read, each new translation adding another chapter to a story that has only begun to be told. At the top of a hill in southeastern Turkey, a discovery continues to rewrite the story of civilization itself. Göbekli Tepe is far from neglected. In popular history, it often appears as a single dramatic headline: the world's first temple, 11,000 years old, built by hunter-gatherers. But that headline barely scratches the surface. The full weight of what Göbekli Tepe means is still sinking in. and it is reshaping not just our timeline but our entire understanding of why humans settled down in the first place. For decades, the standard model of the Neolithic revolution taught that people first developed farming in small villages, and only later, once they had surplus food and settled lives, did they begin building monuments and practicing organized religion. The field of plenty came first, then the temple. Göbekli Tepe turns that sequence on its head. Here, hunter-gatherers who had not yet domesticated wheat or barley, who still lived in temporary shelters and moved with the seasons, came together to carve stone pillars weighing many tons, to erect circular enclosures, and to hold gatherings that must have involved feasting, ritual, and the coordination of hundreds of people over many years. The labor alone required a level of social organization that scholars once thought impossible without a settled agricultural base. The implication is profound. Perhaps the urge to gather, to celebrate, to worship, was the engine that drove the shift to farming, not the other way around. People may have begun cultivating wild grains not because they were hungry, but because they needed reliable supplies of food to support the growing crowds that came to these ceremonial centers for festivals and rites. The temple built the village, not the village the temple, and the excavations at Göbekli Tepe are far from complete. Each new digging season reveals more structures, more enclosures, more evidence that the site was not a single isolated monument but part of a much larger complex. Archaeologists have now identified multiple circular enclosures spread across the hilltop, some still buried beneath accumulated soil. The oldest layers at the very bottom of the mound have only been sampled in small trenches. The deepest secrets may be even older than the pillars we already know, pushing the timeline back further into a past that we are only beginning to glimpse. The site also forces a reconsideration of what we mean by civilization. Göbekli Tepe was not a city. There were no houses, no storage rooms, no signs of permanent residence. It was a gathering place, a destination for pilgrimages that drew people from across the region. The stone pillars are carved with intricate reliefs of foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and other animals, each one carefully chosen and positioned. These are not random decorations. They are a symbolic language, a way of encoding stories, beliefs, or clan identities. This level of symbolic communication, without writing, without a settled population, suggests that the human capacity for abstract thought and shared meaning is far older and more powerful than we ever assumed. For all its fame, Göbekli Tepe is still a site whose full implications are often glossed over. It is easy to mention it as a curiosity, a strange outlier that predates the pyramids. But if we take it seriously, it upends the entire narrative of how complex society emerged. The drive to build something greater than a single home, to carve meaning into stone, to come together for reasons beyond survival. These impulses were not late products of civilization. They were present at the very beginning, perhaps even before the first seeds were planted. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. As we have seen across this journey, from the older layers at Boncuklu Tarla to the industrial landscapes of Wadi Faynan, from the urban centers of Hamoukar to the mountaintop capital of Monte Albán, the story of our ancestors is not a single straight line. It is a tapestry of countless threads, each one woven by people who found their own solutions to the challenges of life, who built their own monuments, their own systems of belief, and their own versions of civilization. Göbekli Tepe stands as a powerful reminder that the past is not a finished story. It is a living record, still being unearthed, still surprising us, still forcing us to ask new questions. The site has already reshaped ancient history, but it is only one of many. The ground beneath our feet holds countless other secrets, each one waiting to challenge what we think we know about who we are and where we came from. The journey does not end here. It only continues deeper into the earth, deeper into time, and deeper into the mystery of what it means to be human. The thread that ties these 25 sites together is one of hidden complexity, a reminder that our ancient past was far more interconnected, innovative, and layered than any simplified timeline can capture. Each neglected discovery, from the older temples of Boncuklu Tarla to the industrial landscape of Wadi Faynan, from the ritual burials at Lake Mungo to the silent faces of Sanxingdui, offers a piece of evidence that challenges what we thought we knew about when our ancestors achieved certain milestones, how they connected across vast distances, and what they were capable of long before the rise of the familiar empires. These are not isolated oddities. They form a mosaic that depicts a world where innovation arose independently in multiple cradles, where trade networks spanned continents, and where symbolic expression appeared tens of thousands of years earlier than once believed. The textbooks we grew up with are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They tell a story that has been simplified for clarity, and that simplification has left out entire civilizations, entire waves of migration, entire chapters of human endeavor. What we have explored here is just the beginning. There are more sites waiting to be fully excavated, more artifacts waiting to be dated, more scripts waiting to be deciphered. And somewhere beneath the sand, the jungle, or the permafrost, there are discoveries that will reshape our understanding yet again. That is the beauty of archaeology. It is a field that never settles. Every new season of digging brings the potential to overturn what we thought was settled. So I encourage you to keep exploring, to question the simple stories, and to appreciate that history is a living, breathing record, still being written with every trowel stroke and every radiocarbon test. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten corners of our past, please subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the mysteries of archaeology. Drop a comment below with your own favorite overlooked site, the one you think deserves more attention from the world, and check out the related videos on the screen, because the trail of discovery does not end here. The ground beneath our feet holds countless more secrets. The greatest discoveries may still be buried, waiting for the right moment to step into the light.